So talk to me about the project, your inspiration, your creative process.
Um, it's interesting that I'm talking to you, Maxine, because I think I was just looking at my phone a couple months ago, and I took a photograph of the novel, the cover of the novel, and it was I think it was November 2nd, 2017, and you'd recommended that novel to me.
Yay!
Yes, you had recommended it to me. We were at the Lightbox for your brother's birthday, I think it was.
Right.
That's right, November 2nd. And you said, you should read this novel, and I hadn't heard of it at that time. And and uh and I remember I took the photograph, and then I sort of put it away. I put it out of my mind for a while. And and then I was in a bookstore, and I saw the novel, and I thought, well, I'm going on a vacation. This could be a
Right.
good beach read.
Right.
And that summer, I went away to St. Lucia with my family, and I read it in 2 days. Just like it was,
Right.
it was very quick. And at that time, someone else was approached me about the novel in terms of, you should think about this. We
Mm,
read it. I'd love to partner with you and Damon
mm.
on this novel. And so, 6 months later, after you recommended it, I read it, and then I subsequently, Damon and I optioned it with Hawkeye Pictures,
Right.
and and then that Christmas I wrote it, quickly, and I loved it. As soon as I read it, I loved it. I knew these guys. I knew
Uh,
this family. I mean,
right.
my family was, immigrants to Canada, to Toronto.
Mhm.
And I grew up in an environment very similar to the guys that were in the novel, to Michael and Francis and their mom
Mm.
in the novel. So I knew the world, and I hung out in Scarborough, so I knew Scarborough well. So,
Ah,
you know, so the feel in the novel I knew, and it just came out of me very, very quickly.
and so one, I'm reading in the TIFF program notes that the two brothers are Jamaican as opposed
Yes,
to Trinidadian. So
yes.
how did that come about? Was that a negotiation with the author or not?
It's when I read the book, it spoke to me, and like you said, the brothers in the family, they're Trinidadians, and of course, I was born in Jamaica. I came here as a kid, and so I wanted it to be as personal as I could
Mhm.
make it. And I was nervous, when I optioned the novel, I was nervous about broaching the subject with David Cheriandy,
Mhm.
who and then David was very, very generous. He was, said, Clement, it's yours to do what you will. And so,
Mhm.
um, I didn't change the story at all that way. I changed it, so it's just a little bit of cultural
Mm.
specificity. I
Right.
wanted to infuse, but I left a lot of the kind of more specific Trinidadian elements that were in the novel that
Okay.
David Terriani wrote. But I
Right.
wanted to just like little sort of just little nuances, that if you're Jamaican, you would pick up.
Right. Okay, because I was really interested in, I haven't seen the film, but I was really interested in why it was important to make that cultural shift. And so you've kind of talked about that. So that's
Yeah,
cool.
yeah. Just to make it very, very, I wanted to make it very
Mm,
personal. You know what I mean? It's
mm,
as with this film, I wanted it to be almost play as memory, and
mm.
to also, when I with the producers, I said to them, look, I want to make this film to honor our immigrant parents.
Mm.
You know what I mean? And so, and for me to really almost infuse myself into it in a way that it was unconscious,
Mm.
I had to make it as personal as I could, because when you make films and when you write a film, you don't understand, always know why you're writing a scene or a moment, or you know, and I didn't want it to be intellectual. You know, I wanted it to be emotional and instinctive and unconscious, you know.
Mm.
And the way for me was to really make it as personal as I could.
And coming out of the last few years and wanting to make it very specific and honor our immigrant parents
Yes.
who made big, bold choices, right? To leave the
Sacrifice. Yeah.
country and
Yeah.
huge sacrifices. So, what were the similarities that you saw in the book that you wanted to bring? And what were the ones that weren't there that you infused?
Well, I think the familiarity with David's novel was his kind of investigation around masculinity
Mm,
and the performance of masculinity by young Black men, and how it plays itself out in the world. And it's, you know, it's something that I'm curious about. It. It's something that I'm familiar with just in terms of my other work. And just to, you know, I wanted to investigate that. And um, this idea of uh, family, and the idea of sacrifice a mother would make for
mm,
her for her child, you know, for her children. You know, my mom came to Canada by herself with four siblings. I know, you know, and we, you know, I never really appreciated that sacrifice
mhm,
until I had my own child, and
right.
realized the courage it must have taken for a woman in her early 30s to make that kind of
Mm,
sacrifice, you know. So those kind of the exploration of masculinity, the performance of masculinity by young Black men, um, you know, young men who are seen on the outside world in one way, but you know, for me, is, you
inside.
know, inside is there's a kind of vulnerability, there is a
Mhm,
kind of um, questioning, there's a kind of curiosity that you can't really fully explore, you
mm,
know, because you have to put up a
a
kind of
mask.
mask,
Yeah.
you know what I mean, a mask around it. So I want to explore that, and this idea of, you know, again, a family, and what was um different. I mean, I can't say there was anything specifically different in the novel that um that I didn't truly understood. uh i think i think um I think David Cheriandi's passion and love of music is probably bigger than mine, you know.
Mm,
And his, you know, what's wonderful about reading that novel is the infusion of music, and his references to music
hmm.
is so, it permeates the whole novel.
Well, I
And
was
he's
going to ask you
and
about that.
yeah, yeah, and he introduced me to music that I didn't know. I mean, you know, certain songs by Nina Simone that I didn't know, and you know, and so that was a, you know, a gift in terms of,
Hmm.
you know, once, you know, to sort of explore that, and to discover things that I didn't know about my own Black
Huh.
music history.
That's interesting because I was going to, every time I've run into you, since you told me about this film, I've been asking you, better have a good soundtrack. So, and I know you've heard me loud and clear. And probably the third time I asked you, you probably just shut me out. In the book, because it's
Right.
so incredible in the book, do the music and the sounds of Scarborough, like the languages and sirens and traffic,
Yes.
do they factor into the film? And how did you
Yeah.
do?
Well, I think the environment, the environment that David Cheriandi um, describes, you know, in his novel. You know, I wanted to make sure that we capture that in the film. So the urban landscape, you know, um, I wanted to capture, but not in a kind of, you know, documentary way. I wanted to, again, put my own spin on it, because I didn't want to make it a meditation on social, on poverty, or
Mm,
on I wasn't that interested in making, say, a classic hood movie in that
mhm,
way,
mhm,
um but and there's a poetry in the novel that
yeah.
I wanted to really capture in the film. And there is and his brilliance, the brilliance of the novel is the way David plays with time and a sense of memory.
Mhm,
That's that was, for me, was the most challenging part of trying to capture that sense of place and memory,
mhm,
capturing the place,
mhm,
the sounds and the environment, the smell of the place, the food he describes,
mhm.
you know, and the music, and of course the music. And the music is tough because music is so expensive.
Yeah. Keep telling
as
me that. You
a as
keep
a
telling me
as a
that.
filmmaker, it's hard to, they're very, very expensive. But you always ask me about Sister Nancy, and I will
Mhm.
give you a spoiler that we do have a Sister Nancy. I'm not going to tell you the track, but there is a Sister Nancy.
Okay, okay, okay. Um, is this film beyond the visual storytelling? Will I be driven to go to, you know, a music streaming service and, be inspired to create my own brother soundtrack?
That's what I'm hoping. I'm hoping that
Okay.
once people see the film and hear the film and feel the film, that they will want to seek out Black music. I mean, I'm Jamaican, so so I probably lean towards more the sort of Jamaican side. But I'm also a lover of hip hop. I'm also a lover of
Mhm.
R&B soul. I'm also a lover of African soul music. And so and also I'm also a lover of European classical music.
Mm.
So it's a mixture and amalgamation of all these various sounds that I love, and hopefully
Oh,
it works successfully in the film.
okay. Now, because you did the adaptation of this the novel, um, and you didn't work with David Cheriandri, he gave you his blessing, said
Yes.
go with God, and you wanted it to be personal. I can't recall. Do you have brothers or do you have sisters? You have
I
male
have
siblings?
I have one brother and two sisters, and they haven't seen the movie yet. They're
Mm,
coming to see it. When it world premiere. So it's obviously, I'm a little bit nervous about that. But with David Cheriandy, even though it was a personal film, any kind of major decisions I had to make, I
mhm,
would always call David and say, what do you think of this idea? Just to use him as a sounding board,
mhm,
and
mhm,
he was very generous with his time, and he was very generous with offering any kind of insight, because he's such a good storyteller, and he's such a
mhm,
great writer of character. And I wanted to rely, as not to get his approval, but just to get
mhm,
his take on
mhm.
on what it is,
His
because I think
reinterpretation,
said,
because
yes,
it's like a
right.
reinterpretation of his novel, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Mm.
It's what is I guess you would describe as, I guess, a remix.
Yes, 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 yes,
It's a
yes,
remix of his novel.
yes.
And he was, yeah, he's such a smart,
Mm,
thoughtful writer, that I wanted to make sure that I would um seek out his advice. And at some point, every filmmaker, if they're adapting a story or adapting a novel, have to at some point own it themselves.
mhm,
You know, you want to honor the original piece,
mhm,
but at the same time, you want to um, put yourself in it as much as you can.
mm. Now I know casting is very important to you.
Mhm.
I've had the opportunity to observe you. well, one, I've had a number of my friends were in Rude, your first film. So I remember them talking about the audition process. And I got to observe you a bit with Planet of Junior Brown when you were looking for the lead there.
Mhm.
Talk to me about how you went about casting this particular film.
You know, the casting was really an interesting process for me because we wanted to make this film pre-pandemic.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, and we got the financing for the film just before the pandemic broke.
Mhm.
Um, Aaron Pierre, I met. I must have been maybe March, in the middle of March, 2020, in Los Angeles, because at that point I wanted to try to cast it to make it that summer, and so the summer of 2020. So I met Aaron Pierre, and I met him at the London hotel, and he walked in, and I just thought, oh, this is really an interesting character. That's not how I saw Michael. So that's not how I saw Francis. But you
Right.
know, when I met him and started talking to him, I liked him. There was a kind of, at that point I didn't see his audition. All I knew was he told me that he had he had done Barry Jenkins miniseries Underground Railroad,
Right.
and so I hadn't seen it at that point. And when we spoke, there was a there's a kind of masculinity in him. There's a, you know, that I love, but there's also a kind of vulnerability that there he has this kind of duality in him,
Mm.
you know, which I like. You know, he's a beautiful specimen, you know.
Mhm.
I don't think he would mind me saying that. He's a beautiful specimen of a man, you know. He's very tall
Mhm.
and he's very
Mhm.
fit and he's young, and you know, is very, you know, has that kind of what would be viewed as a sort of classically masculine person.
Mhm.
But you know, but there is this tenderness in him, and a
Mhm.
vulnerability in him that I suddenly saw for Francis. You know,
Mhm.
you know, and he basically kept, you know, the pandemic hit, and I said, look, we're gonna try to make this film this summer, and he auditioned. He sent us a tape. He sent us his audition for Underground Railroad,
Mhm.
which I loved, and then he sent us his audition for Francis, and I loved it. I thought he was just brilliant. His what I saw and felt when I met him was on that tape that he
Mhm.
sent on his audition, and you know, the pandemic hit and everything shut down and we couldn't make it, and you know, every few months, you know, we would talk, and I said, look, I want you for my movie. You're my star. You know, you're my Francis, and um, we're gonna make it. In you know, we're gonna try to make it in 2020. But of course,
You're right.
nothing. Nobody was making anything in 2020. You know, and then we finally managed to make it in 2021, and he was my Francis. You know, and Lamar Johnson. Lamar is someone I met Lamar that earlier that same year. In 2020 I met him, and he's someone that I was tracking over time. You know, I saw him in the Hate You Give, and I seen it in a film called Kings, and I
Mhm.
knew that he was you know, a TIFF Rising Stars in 2018, and
Mhm.
he was someone that you know, I wanted. Oh, you know, I was curious. I thought he could be the lead, you know, and Lamar has this, because I needed someone who could communicate with his eyes, you know,
Mhm.
because oftentimes you're casting someone's eyes, you're casting their energy, but you also casting their gaze, you know. What
Mhm.
I mean by that is that so much of the film is from Michael's point of view,
Right.
and so you know, and he's so silent in the movie. He's very silent in the movie,
Mhm.
so I needed someone who could communicate, who, you know, put the camera on someone that would let the audience know what was going on with them, you know,
See
and
that emotional journey,
journey
but through
exactly
their eyes. Yeah.
through their eyes and without a lot of dialogue. And Lamar had that, you know, because you know, in the two timelines, he's in 90% of the scenes, you know. So I needed that person to do that and communicate that. And he was my anchor, you know,
Mm,
because he was the one that's taking us through the film. Marsha Stephanie Blake, I met Marsha Stephanie Blake. I saw a film called Loose.
mm,
And Marsha Stephanie Blake is in that film with Octavia Spencer, and
right.
she has a scene in Loose that is so magnificent and so brave
Mm.
that I thought, you know, I need to meet her, and I knew she was Jamaican because I was looking for someone
Right.
Jamaican
You
from
could
a
do the
Jamaican
accent,
who could do
right?
the accent and who
Uh,
could do, and you know, I met her over Zoom, and she I came to Canada when I was 11 years old, and Marsha Stephanie came when she was, and I came to Toronto then, and Marsha Stephanie left Jamaica when she was 12 and went to Brooklyn with her
mm,
family, you know. Um, you know, I'm a little bit older than her, so I knew that I wouldn't have to translate a whole lot to her. You know what I mean? Because she would intuitively understand
right.
that she's playing our mothers.
Right.
You know what I mean? And she's you know, we're very similar in that way because we're very similar in terms of we weren't supposed to be artists. We were supposed to be maybe academics or something, you know, but
Right.
we chose to be artists, you know, because I mean, I have no doubt that Marsha Stephanie could be a doctor because her sister's a doctor, but
Right.
you know, but she chose to be an actor,
Well,
and
her sister took one for the team.
that's right, exactly,
Took
because you
one for the
know,
team.
because we all, because that's what the, you know, the parents of immigrants want. They want their
Mhm,
children to be lawyers and
mhm,
doctors and professionals,
mhm.
and
Exactly.
yeah, and you know, and Marcia intuitively, I didn't have to translate anything to her. I didn't have to
Mm.
direct her all that much. You know, we would just have I would have to just say a couple words and she would get it. You know, and what was great about Marcia is that not only with the acting, was also just with the sets and the location, which is she would walk onto the set and she would look around and she would say something about the plates. And I'm like, and it's like the plates are not this, you know what I mean, or the photograph on the wall, or
Right.
you know, you need a bookshelf with the, you know, and I would like, yes,
So she
because
got it
she
totally.
got it. She didn't. I didn't have
Totally.
again. It's like when you work with someone like that that
Mhm.
really understood what, you know, what I was trying to do with a film,
Right.
got it, you know, and you know, and Keanu, who plays Aisha, I just loved her audition. She auditioned, and she, you know, I mean, I use her part of her biography in the story. Her, I think, you know, one of her parents is from Portugal, another parent Black, and so I wanted, you know, which is a very Toronto, very
Mhm.
Canadian,
Yeah.
you know, upbringing in some ways. You know, it's a very Scarborough
Yeah.
upbringing. You
Exactly.
know, you know, and so she, you know, I knew she would get it, and that's, you know, that's how I really run out of my cast, and you know, and I'm really happy, and that, you know, that I called in some people that I knew, you know, that I didn't want to read. I just said, look, can you come and do a couple of days for me, because I knew, because I worked with them in the past, and I didn't
Right.
want to, you know, just love you to come and to do me this favor, and you know.
Talking about who you've worked, because you have worked with an impressive list of creators on some really incredible content. So you've worked with Ingenue Ellis,
Mhm, mhm,
Lynn Whitfield,
mhm,
Keith David,
mhm.
and I believe there's a woman in America who her last name begins with a W. So you've also worked with Oprah.
Yes.
Did you call on any of those people to be in the film?
You know, I didn't call on any of those people to be in the film. But what was amazing was I made the Book of Negroes in
Mhm,
2015, 16, and Oprah saw that, her company saw that, and they invited me to, in essence, audition for a job
mhm.
to be a director producer on Greenleaf. I auditioned, I got the job, and I subsequently spent 5 years working with someone like Oprah and Lynn and Keith
Hmm.
and a number of other actors. And what I realize now that I didn't realize then was it was really a gift to me because it gave me a chance. I can't recall how many episodes I did. It must have been maybe, I don't know, over the 5 years, maybe 12 or 14. I can't remember. But what was great about that was I got a chance to hire directors and I got a chance to practice as a director,
Mm.
on a great show, on a show that worked.
Hmm.
Because I did the pilot, and I was there for all five, all of the seasons,
And you
and
produced that show, right?
I produced it. Yeah, I was a producer on the ground in Atlanta, so I would see how other directors work because oftentimes you don't get to see that,
Hmm. Hmm.
and you learn things. And one of the things I learned was I always loved the directors who were specific and who you could tell they would somehow infuse who they are, their personality into the work, and
Mm.
that's for me. I am I always loved and it gave me gave me a chance to practice. And then what was great in the first season of that of Greenleaf, I had a chance to the first two seasons of Greenleaf. I had a chance to direct Oprah. And I, it was intimidating because she's my boss, but
Hmm.
I'm also her director. And so
Mm.
what was amazing to me and was, you know, she wanted a director.
Mm.
She wanted someone that was that would be thoughtful about what it is that they were doing, and that was great. And then working with Lynn, I became a better director. Working with Oprah, working with Lynn, working with the cast, I became a better director.
Mm-hmm.
And someone with working with someone like Lynn, I got to know her instrument so well because I saw her every day and worked together every day. I got to know her instrument real well that we didn't even have to speak.
Wow.
Oftentimes we would just look at each other, have the moments, and you know, and I, and Lynn, in a way, taught me to be braver as a
Director.
director. Yeah, because Lynn would, she would take risk. I would see her. It was always sort of inspiring and moving. So sometimes to
Mm.
see when an actor, and Lynn was one of them. All the actors took risks, but Lynn had this way of kind of like stepping out and just like may
Mm.
work or may not work, and
Right.
it forced me to, because I had a very restrained, controlled
Hmm.
approach to directing, and working with someone, Lynn, she's gonna like step into the unknown.
Right.
And so
Right.
it forced me to also be able to step into the unknown, and it made me a better director.
And because I was going to ask you how your direction or your approach to directing has changed from short films to features to working on a series.
Right.
And what do you adjust when you make that jump from working on a series to working on going back to a feature now and a personal feature?
Yeah. When I was making my own as a writer director, making short films and my first feature film, I thought part of my job as a director was to be a acting teacher.
Mm.
You know what I mean? I used to think that that was part of my job. If
Hmm.
I wasn't getting the performance, I had to, you know, figure out how to teach actors how to, which was very naive and very arrogant in some ways.
Hmm.
Um, as a writer, a director, and then when I started working as an episodic director, as a kind of what I call a hard hat
Hmm.
director,
Hmm.
with my short films and feature films, I've hired everybody and
Hmm.
I've gotten to know them a little bit, and I've spent time with them, and they've known that I chose them to play these parts. But in episodic directing, you haven't chosen anybody. You
Hmm.
might have chosen the day players and the guest
Hmm.
star of the episode. You might not have chosen them. You might have recommended that person to this network or the studio to say,
Right.
these are the three people I think could play
Right.
the could be our guest star. And you might have one vision for that part, and then and the
Hmm.
network has another vision.
Right.
And then you have the regulars, the on the show, which They don't know you. They don't.
Right.
Um, you have to figure out how to develop rapport and trust with them very quickly. And trying to teach someone who's been on a show for 2 3 years how to act is not it's not going to work.
Right. Yep.
You
Yep.
know,
Yep.
so then I quickly had to develop the skill and of how to communicate and how to figure out how to get the performance I saw in my head
Hmm.
through this
Through
cast that I
them.
didn't hire
Right.
and who I don't know that well.
Right.
And also to try to navigate the unknown politics that I don't know about
Hmm.
among the cast members, which is all, which sometimes work in certain shows, and so um my approach now is to listen more,
Hmm.
to not coming into a moment or a scene with a preconceived idea of what that scene should be,
Hmm. To
you
allow
know,
it to
to,
happen.
to allow it to happen, and to then figure out the language with that person, because there's always, every actor is different, so you're always trying to figure out what language do they need, what kind of director do they need from me,
Hmm.
and trying to figure that out as quickly as you can.
That's a big
So,
lesson. It's a big
yeah,
lesson.
so that's, so it's a different thing when you hire someone, and you've, it's a different process.
Mm. Okay, so we don't have an awful lot of time left, and I thank
you
you
know
for being so generous with all of your responses.
Absolutely.
So you started off as alumni, and I know
Uh-huh.
you had another career prior to. You weren't a doctor, but you had another career prior to entering the film center, the Canadian Film Center. Do you want to talk about that transition?
Absolutely. In a previous life, in my early 20s, late teens, early 20s, up until around age 25, I was in the fashion industry. I wanted to. I did. I bought clothing for a while. I did window displays. I wanted to be a designer. I thought I was going to be Tom Ford. I often joke that Tom Ford has my life, because Tom Ford has a life that I sort of,
Right.
I imagine for myself, having this fabulous line and also making movies,
Mm,
you know.
mhm.
Um,
Right.
and the transition um, came was a, and the CFC was very key to this transition, which was when I was thinking about changing careers and I was making short films on the side. I there was a program that I heard about that was at the CFC in the summer of 1991. Now I guess 31 years ago.
Good God.
31 years ago, I was 23 or something. Um, and uh, and it was a program for 1 month program in the August 91 for filmmakers of color.
Mm,
And it was an initiative for that was set up by the CFC, because at that time the CFC had been around, I think, at that point maybe 4 years,
mhm,
5 years, and they hadn't. I think only one person of color had gone through the CFC, and the
mm,
CFC was trying to get more BIPOC filmmakers to apply and come through the CFC. And that summer, um, I met Damon D'Oliveira, who's my business partner, who's still my business partner. Damon came in as a producer, a resident. That year, I met Mina Shum,
mhm.
who's a filmmaker from Vancouver, and I'm actually going to see Mina in Vancouver in about a month or so. She's going to interview me. She's going to moderate a panel that I'm on.
Good.
So Mina Shum was there. Karen King, who was my one of my producers on Rude, my
Mhm.
very first feature film. Stephen Williams,
As a film in this year's festival.
who has a film in this year's festival. So that program, that the CFC, that 91 program, was a very important program to help
Mm,
launch
mhm.
a generation of filmmakers.
Pivotal.
Um, yeah, and then after I finished that program, the CFC had a 9 month program that they invited me to apply for. And I was encouraged to apply, and I think myself and Stephen Williams and I think a few others were encouraged to apply, and I applied with my script Rude, my first feature film,
Mhm.
and I got in.
Fantastic.
Um, but I got in as a writer. I didn't get in as a director because I've only
Really?
yeah, because at that point I'd only directed one little short film. Um, and while I was there, I wrote a lot at the CFC, and I would talk my way into get into direct videos, and the various sort of exercises
Hmm.
on the campus there on the grounds,
Uh-huh.
where you would run off into the parking lot, or
Right.
back then there was a fabulous pool.
Oh,
um
yes, that's right.
you could
No, it's no
you
longer. It's no longer.
and I would participate in the directing exercises. And I the CFC was making a few short films that year. I talked my way into making a short film. Um, and that short film got accepted into the Toronto International Film Festival.
Yeah.
And that short film won the best short film at TIFF that year. Um, and then the CFC had a program called the Feature Film Project,
Hmm.
run by two people, Colin Brunton and Justin White.
Hmm.
And it was a program for first-time feature films, for graduates primarily.
Hmm.
And I had just graduated, and I applied with my film Rude with Damon Dolabella and Karen King. And
Wow.
that's how I made my first short film. And Wayne Clarkson was very instrumental, because Wayne Clarkson had your job at that time.
Right.
And Norman Jewison was he subsequently became my mentor,
Wow.
and he was very instrumental in providing inspiration and insight, and just
Hmm.
advice on the various cuts of Rude. And Rude got into the Cannes Film Festival,
Mm.
and that really what launched my career. So the CFC has been pivotal and instrumental
Mm.
in my career, and setting me on a path that I'm still very, very grateful for.
Hmm.
And I'm very proud of my affiliation with the CFC, and um, because they've helped shape the industry. They've helped
Mm.
create,
And you
yeah.
also, I mean, not only do you have this long and strong relationship with the city, but now you're also on the board.
Yes.
So, so, I guess it's true, once you're in, we don't let you go.
Yes,
Um,
yes. It's the CFC is very close to my heart. Nobody can say anything bad to me about the CFC. I defend the CFC. You know what I mean? It's like the CFC it's been proven. It's been an institution that has really helped to create the ecosystem of
mm,
the Canadian film industry. With the writers, the directors, the composers, the producers. And every year there's always graduates and alumni who've gone through the CFC, who have films that play internationally, in both film
and television
and
now.
television. So
Mm.
yeah, I mean,
We're going to keep
I
on
appreciate it.
doing what we do
Yeah.
right. That's
Yes.
what we're going to do. We're going to keep on doing what we do right
Yeah.
and, try and stay relevant to people like yourselves and all the new young talent coming in.
Yeah. And the CFC were in some ways they were on the vanguard
Mhm.
31 years ago, in terms of institutions, in terms of recognizing that, hey, we've been around for 4 years, and we need to do better in terms of trying
Mm.
to represent the community and represent what we see in the greater society, by
Hmm.
inviting these young filmmakers who, because when the CFC first, I remember when I first heard about the CFC, was this kind of rarefied place,
Mm,
and it's such an intimidating place when you first would go up there. It's like,
mhm,
wow, this is like
mhm,
beautiful house, beautiful grounds. Do I belong in this space? And of course, the CFC was very invited into that space and say, yes, everyone's invited to participate in the space.
Well, I've only been at the CFC for just over a year, and everything you said is quite encouraging. I want to know, do you have any words of wisdom or advice for any new creators coming into the CFC and going out into the industry?
I think what's looking back, even looking back at my own experiences at the CFC, what I had a chance to do, which I was very grateful for, was a chance to practice craft and
Mm,
to be sort of steeped and to really focus on trying to be a better writer and trying to be a better director.
mhm,
So I would, and what was great about the CFC is that at that time and still is, which is the guests that would get invited to. We had some marvelous guests
mhm,
come in, directors, writers, producers, who come in and talk to us about their process,
mhm,
and about their journey and about their craft. So I would encourage um, anyone at the CFC to really hone and develop your craft, because I think there's always a sense that when you leave, will I get the opportunity? Will I get the opportunity? And I believe everyone will get their opportunity.
mm,
But when you do get your opportunity, will you be ready? Will
mhm,
your will that skills that you've honed at the CFC will help you to kind of navigate that environment that you might
mhm,
find yourself in on set and so forth. And second thing I would say really is look, the people that are in your group will be your contemporaries,
mhm,
because the people that I went to film school with at the CFC are my contemporaries.
mhm.
Nina Shum, like I mentioned earlier,
Right.
Stephen Williams, my producer that I met at the CFC. So it's an opportunity to network. It's an opportunity to look around and say, who have like-minded taste,
Mhm,
and who can I subsequently work with, to help, because we can't, no one could do it by themselves. You need a partnership, and the CFC is a great environment to
mm,
to forge those partnerships, to learn your craft, forge you know, forge the partnerships, and to learn about the business
mhm,
of being an entrepreneur, in terms of, because that's what we all are as independent writer, as independent writers, directors, producers. We're kind of, in a way, entrepreneurs. So the CFC also helped shape that, shape those skills.
So, last question. We are a few days out before, how many days before your premiere? Is it seven?
I think it's 7 days now.
So, 7 days out before your premiere at the Toronto International Film Festival. And what advice would you have for fellow creators going to their first film festival, either with a film in the festival or attending the festival without a film? What advice?
If you have a film, the first advice I would say is, two things really, is really enjoy it. As a younger filmmaker, um, you take these moments for granted, you
Mm,
know, and I look back at my first time at TIFF, with my short film and with my first feature films and the films that I didn't really take the time to really be in the moment,
mm,
you know, and
to
to
relish,
savor,
to
to
relish.
relish it and to savor savor it, because it's such
Mhm.
it's a rare occasion.
Mm,
And
mhm,
especially now after 2 years of COVID, it's like I'm now much more hyper aware that,
mm,
you know, after 2 years of a festival and the CFC, not being up at the CFC and
mhm,
not being at
mhm,
TIFF, that when you have these moments now, you can't take it for granted. You have to really savor the moments,
mhm.
you know. So I want to savor it,
Good.
because who knows, in terms of if I get the opportunity again. I hope I do. I think I will. But it's just to be at TIFF and to have that experience.
Mm,
And the second thing is really the theatrical experience is such is is challenged now. As a filmmaker, and I make films for people to sit in a theater and watch them.
mhm,
So I'm looking forward, and what I would encourage other filmmakers, if you don't have a film, or even if you do have a film, is to take the opportunity to watch movies, to
mhm,
see what your fellow filmmakers are doing from around the world, and to really explore and study and become curious about what others are doing, and sometimes we get caught up in the parties and the networking that, some of my best experiences. I remember seeing City of God at TIFF.
yes. Great
Just
film.
like randomly, I heard this film was good, and somebody mentioned it, and I thought, let me go and see this film called City of God at TIFF, and it was absolutely extraordinary.
Mhm,
I remember, with my short film, I remember seeing Aniesa Bumsawin's film on the Oka crisis
mhm.
called,
I can't remember.
I think it's Kinesige Taki. I think that's Kinesige Taki. And I remember seeing that film with my first short film at TIFF, and I was so moved that it influenced imagery in my first feature film.
Hmm.
I was so moved by, and just so, I never really understood the country, and fully, and the history the history of the country, and the conflicts within the country, and fully understand it until I saw her documentary
Hmm.
and being inspired by that. So I would say, see films. I saw 12 Years a Slave, and I saw Parasites. It's like, just go and see films. I saw Sweet Hereafter.
Mhm.
I saw Double Happiness, Mina's
Oh,
film. So
Mila's
so
music film.
yeah, so you just go and see films, um, and savor the moment,
Good
because
advice.
it's not guaranteed.
Mr. Virgo, congratulations on Brother and
Thank you.
its upcoming world premiere at TIFF. Thank you for your time, and thank you for speaking so kindly about the CFC. And I wish you luck. And I cannot wait to see this film in
And
the
I
way
got,
you want me to see it
yes,
in the theater.
and I got that Sister Nancy for you, just for you.
Yes. Okay. Thank
All
you
right.
so much, Clement.
Thank
This is great.
All
Have a
right.
good evening. Take care.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.